Hello and welcome to this HESES training video. In this video we're going to look at HESES multiplication factors. This is how we translate the years of engagement reported in HESES into the values that are used in our funding methods. We'll look at the background to these and then how they are used to derive the funding FTEs, the funding full-time equivalents that we use in our funding calculations. In certain circumstances, providers can make representations for the use of different factors, so we'll look at the criteria under which we will consider those representations. And then we look at multiplication factors in the HESES workbook, and we'll have an example of that as well. We'll describe how to submit representations and look at the representations timeline. Finally, we'll describe the documentation on multiplication factors and the representations process. As we have seen in earlier videos, the OFS provides funding on the basis of the study activity of eligible students on courses recognised as higher education for OFS funding purposes. We use HESES data as a proxy for determining this study activity. Up until HESES 23, HESES collections included a count of the number of students that were not expected to complete their intended study activity for the year, previously known as non-completions, and of part-time study. These were used to adjust the counts of years of engagement to get a final full-time equivalence or FTE that would be used in our funding calculations. If you have the chance to look back at old HESES returns, you will see places for this data to be collected in what were called columns 3 and 4A, but in the latest workbooks, these are no longer present. So we need a way to convert raw counts of years of engagement into FTE for the funding calculations. So to do this, we apply multiplication factors to the count of years of engagement in the HESES workbook. We derive these from previous provider and sector data. When these are applied to the counts of years of engagement in the HESES return, which are essentially headcount figures, we get funding FTEs, which will be used in our calculations of recurrent funding allocations. However, we understand that provision can change from year to year. Courses may have been added, changed or discontinued, or there may be other factors that lead the provider to believe that the multiplication factors are not indicative of their provision. Providers can submit representations on individual multiplication factors that they feel are no longer appropriate using their HESES workbook. It should be stressed at this point that this is not a mandatory process. We can take a look at an example of this in a couple of slides' time, but first we need to work out what the criteria are for making representations. To be considered, proposed alterations to multiplication factors must have a significant and material impact on funding. As such, representations will need to meet certain criteria in order to be considered. It's important to say that these may vary from year to year. Please consult the documentation described at the end of this video for the latest criteria. At the time of recording, these are the criteria that apply. Representations must result in one of the following changes, whichever is smaller. First, representations must result in a predicted change to funding of at least £100,000 or a predicted change to funding of at least 10% of a provider's total funding allocation. These evaluations are made by comparing the indicative funding allocations calculated when applying the multiplication factors to the fundable FTEs shown in the workbook. We'll see an example later in the video. The following price group criteria also apply. For price group A, there must be a change of at least 0.02 or more in the multiplication factor. For price groups B, C1.1, C1.2, C1.3, C2 and D, a change of at least 0.05 or more is required in the multiplication factor. Let's see how this looks in the workbook. Table 3 is divided into 4 sections, A, B, C and D, which makes it very wide. We looked at A and B in an earlier video, so we won't spend more time on them here, but if you haven't seen that video yet, in summary, they contain figures for the numbers in the subject grouping shown on tables 1 and 2, aggregated by the corresponding price groups. The figures in sections A and B can't be amended. So in this video, we'll focus on sections C and D. Let's go through an example to see how this all looks in the workbook. We'll start on table 1 and see how it feeds data through to table 3, where the multiplication factors come into play. So in this example, a provider runs 2 full-time courses that are in subject grouping CAH02-05. So in table 1, section A will record totals of 200 OFS fundable years of engagement and 30 non-fundable years of engagement. We've got to account for the new entrants. So of these, and these go in section B, we have 20 OFS fundable years of engagement and 5 non-fundable years of engagement. There are no overseas students in this example. So table 1 will look something like this. Here is table 3. Notice that it has pulled figures through into sections A, B and C from tables 1 and 2. Note the 200 OFS fundable FTEs and the multiplication factor for this provider's full-time price group B undergraduate students is 0.75. This is applied to the 200 FTE to give a fundable FTE figure of 150. This is the figure which will be used in our funding calculations for years of engagement in this category. The provider feels that 0.75 is no longer an appropriate multiplication factor for price group B at undergraduate level because they discontinued a course that had poor completion rates. The provider uses section D to suggest a multiplication factor of 0.85 and gives a narrative explaining how they arrived at this figure and why it gives a more accurate picture of their current provision in this price group at undergraduate level. If the revised multiplication factor is accepted, applying it to the total of 200 OFS fundable years of engagement gives the figure of 170 FTE, and this will be used in our funding calculations for price group B at undergraduate level instead of the originally calculated figure of 150. For full details, please see the multiplication factors webpage at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/data and analysis/supplying data/data collection/multiplication factors. As usual, everything after the domain name there is hyphenated. Unfortunately, this is rather a long link. I'll put it on the resources slide at the end of this video. And because it's so long, I'll also include there a shortcut to finding it. That page will have a link to the current year's guidance on making representations. Before we get to that point, it's worth reminding ourselves that representations will only be considered if certain criteria are met. As noted earlier, these may vary from year to year, so please check the HESES webpage for links to the current year's guidance. I'm showing the long URL to the current version from the last slide, and we'll do so again at the end of this video. We'll use the criteria in force at the time of recording to give an example. The criteria fall into 2 categories: a change in multiplication factor and the effect on indicative funding. On the first of these, the change in multiplication factor, currently for price group A there must be a change of at least 0.02 or more in the multiplication factor. For price groups B, C1.1, C1.2, C1.3, C2 and D there must be a change of at least 0.05 or more in the multiplication factor. So in our example, the change suggested is from 0.75 to 0.85, a difference of 0.10. So this criterion is met. The effect on indicative funding must also be considered. As we saw before, representations must result in one of the following changes, whichever is smaller: a predicted change to funding of at least £100,000 or a predicted change to funding of at least 10% of a provider's total funding allocation. To do these evaluations, we must compare indicative funding allocations calculated when the different multiplication factors are applied to the number of fundable FTEs. That is to say, it's countable years of engagement times multiplication factor times the current funding rate. In our example, with 200 FTE, we get these results. Using the original multiplication factor in the workbook of 0.75, we have 200 FTE times 0.75 times £1,737, which is the rate for fundable students in price group B. This gives us £260,550 on the basis of 150 fundable FTE. Using the suggested multiplication factor of 0.85, this becomes 200 FTE times 0.85 times £1,737, a total of £295,290, and that is on the basis of using 170 fundable FTEs. Remember, consideration of representations will depend on the effect of changes on the provider's indicative funding according to the criteria outlined above. Now let's look again at the health table, Table 4. As we saw earlier, Table 4 has sections A and B for the entry of details about home fee students on certain pre-registration health courses. This allows us to calculate the so-called NMAR supplement. The figures on Table 3 inform our high-cost subject funding allocations, but different considerations apply to the NMAR supplement. So like Table 3, Table 4 has sections C and D to allow multiplication factors to be shown and for representations to be made. If you want to make representations about health course provision, please use section D in the same way that we have just seen on Table 3. Once you have finalized your representations in Table 3 and/or Table 4 in your workbook, submit it via the HESES section of the OFS portal. You can submit representations at any point through the HESES process, but we would strongly recommend submitting in the 2-week period following the final sign-off deadline for the HESES return. Considerations of representations will only begin after that date has passed, and we will use the latest version of the representations that we have received by that time. Be aware that if you submit representations with your HESES data before the HESES sign-off date and then a change to your HESES data is needed, you will then need to ensure that the representations are included in the new workbook and that they remain accurate. By waiting until after the HESES sign-off deadline has passed, you will be able to know then that the data will remain static, and it will also allow you to focus on HESES. HESES data will not be amendable after the final sign-off date. For any representation submissions that amend HESES data, that HESES data will not be used in our funding calculations. Let's look at the timeline for multiplication factor representations. Now, just to reiterate, these times here are modified from the slide that we had in our first video, which showed the timetable. As we saw earlier, some of the key dates vary according to the type of higher education provider involved. That is between further education and sixth form colleges and academies, which we refer to here as FECs, and all other providers. So the first of these is the census date, which, as we've seen before, for FECs is on the 1st of November, for all other providers is on the 1st of December. The submission deadline varies according to the calendar, but valid submissions must be made by noon on the relevant date. For FECs, this is usually in mid-November. For all other providers, it's mid-December. Check our documentation for confirmation of the exact dates each year. This is followed by a period of HESES data verification, and the sign-off deadline is right at the end of January or sometimes at the start of February, depending on how the calendar falls. And this is then followed by the 2-week period that I referred to on the last slide, in which representations for changes to multiplication factors can be made. There is a dedicated page on our website about multiplication factors. The direct address is this: www.officeforstudents.org.uk/data and analysis/supplying data/data collection/multiplication factors. Everything after the domain name, those words are hyphenated, so you can see it on the screen. I'm sorry that it's rather a lengthy URL, so you may find it easier to go via our main HESES webpage, which is at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, and then choose the multiplication factors section from the header. As well as the information there, you will find a link to the current multiplication factors representations process guidance. This has full details about the criteria for acceptance of representation and the current year's submission timeline and deadline timetable. We have a number of resources for providers, and we'll look at the main ones here, but we will also highlight additional resources as we go through this series of recordings. For a high-level view of OFS funding, see our Finance and Funding page, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/for-providers/finance and funding, with the last two parts of that URL having the words hyphenated. For an overview of recurrent funding specifically, add the hyphenated words recurrent funding to the last URL, or perhaps an easier way is to use the search function on our main web page and enter recurrent funding. For more detail about funding, see our annual guide to funding, and you can search for that term on our website to find the latest edition. The best place to start for HESES resources is the main HESES page on the OFS website, which can be found at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, and of course that is HESES. To stay informed about OFS announcements, including those relating to funding, you can sign up for our email alert service. Visit www.officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, and as usual, the last part of that URL is hyphenated. Thank you for listening and watching.